All right, so what you're seeing on the bottom right-hand corner is this picture of a nuclear bomb that's exploded. And there's American soldiers that are lined up to kind of watch this thing way too close. Uh, Accidentally, the United States had caused cancer and exposed them to huge amounts of what's called radiation. And radiation is absolutely devastating. Radiation is nuclear waves that remain after a nuclear reaction. This radiation can sit there for over 50 years, maybe 70, depending on how powerful it is. And we're still seeing consequences today. We found radiation uh, that is radioactive material in Coldwater Creek up in North County. There's been radioactive material that's been dumped. It's underground next to an underground fire in Overland, Missouri, not too far from here. And then in Times Beach, which is an area out in Pacific, Missouri, there's a bunch of radioactive material that was found and cleaned up by the EPA. This stuff is all over the country, not just America. New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, they've just kind of dumped it. They didn't know how to handle it very well, and it hasn't been taken care of. That's just the radioactive material from testing and building bombs. Actually, using the bombs is absolutely devastating. So, when we think of Hiroshima, we talked about how maybe 1% of the actual bomb went off and it killed something like 80 to 150,000 people. Can you imagine if we could get that bomb at 100% reaction where all the hydrogen or helium atoms are just smashing into each other's nuclei and causing all kinds of destruction? And we can't. We've gotten much better at it. The bombs we have today are a lot bigger, a lot more powerful, and they're intercontinental. We can shoot them from country to country. We don't even need a plane driving around dropping it like the Enola Gay anymore. And a big example we talked about was the Tsar, which is the biggest explosion ever done by a country, by the Russians, the USSR, and it scared the snot out of America. It was so powerful, we could pick up on the radiation, the radioactive activity in America, even though they blew it up in Siberia, not around anyone. And they blew it up, I believe, several miles above the ground, and it still ripped through the surface. And that was the biggest bomb we've ever actually exploded on the Earth. However, we have more powerful bombs. Now, the other side of nuclear reactions is we've harnessed the energy for what are called nuclear energy. And you can see in the top left-hand corner those little blue triangles. That's where a lot of these nuclear reactors are. There's about 104 nuclear reactors in the United States today. There's only a couple in Missouri. I don't know if you guys know where. I want you to guess. So one of them we actually talked about in class is right on the campus of Mizzou. There's a small nuclear reactor because they have nuclear science, and you can study that at the University of Missouri. And actually used to have a counselor that her husband was a nuclear scientist that worked up in Columbia. And that's small. The bigger one is in Springfield, Missouri, and it looks like the picture on the right, similar to that. And that actually used to create power in Missouri. Outside of that, there is no other nuclear reactors in Missouri. You can see Illinois has a lot more nuclear reactors. They bought into it much more. It became very unpopular because of nuclear accidents. There's approximately 10,000 nuclear warheads in the United States, and actually I've heard the President of the United States quoted as saying 15 to 20,000. The reason I say these are estimates is because we don't know. The U.S. government obviously won't release the information to us. You know, we know there's nuclear missile silos in Arkansas just south of us. Most of them are believed to be in Nevada and Arizona and Utah, more in desert, desolate areas. There's not a lot of people around. But the truth is we don't know. A lot of it is top secret. So we have, there's estimates we have enough nuclear bombs to destroy the world something like 7 times over. So the bombs we have today are much more powerful, can destroy everything, and from there, how would we regain ourselves? So you have this pure conflict between Americans are building better missiles that become more accurate, and now we can hit Moscow from Arkansas. The Russians are building bigger bombs because they weren't doing as well on the missile technology and the stealth technology they had issues with. So they built huge bombs like the Tsar, and they were just going to drop bigger bombs. And this competition just kept going and going and going, and we're going to find out it goes all the way up to the 90s. So we call this the Cold War. And the Cold War was the union of Soviet Socialist Republic, the USSR, or Russia today. And those are two different things, um, because the Soviet Union is going to fall apart. It was a communist country. Really, in 1949, the USSR was the second country to build an atomic bomb. This is really kind of the point where things go crazy. We knew that we're going to have problems with the Russians even during World War II, probably earlier. And Roosevelt really tried to work with the USSR and Stalin. Truman was much more skeptical. And what happened in the end is the Soviets did actually steal, and there is truth, is they stole a lot of the plans on how to make nuclear weapons, and they stole a lot of our ideas, and that's how they coincidentally were able to build a nuclear bomb in 1949. So there is reason for concern and conflict. The question is, how does this conflict go? And we're going to analyze and see historically what are some of the consequences. So the USSR was the second most powerful country after World War II. You have to understand, there's basically two countries standing after World War II. Everybody else has been leveled. They're done. Okay? The United States is untouched with the exception of Japan, right? And Pearl Harbor and Hawaii. That's about it. There's actually a real quiet secret that a lot of people don't know, that the Japanese did actually bomb America with balloons. It's really interesting. They used balloons and the jet stream, and they had missiles come across the Pacific Ocean using the jet stream, and they did land in America. I think one might have went off. That was about it. Almost no damage. The United States kept it quiet, but we have actually been bombed mainland by the Japanese. It's just not known, and it didn't really do much. So. And the United States feared the USSR could spread communism throughout the world as a result of the Cold War. So then there becomes this big battle between communism versus capitalism. The truth is, if we look in political theory and government next year, we'll talk about the Russians aren't really communists and the Americans aren't really capitalists. We are much more capitalistic than the USSR, and the USSR is much more communist. But neither one of our actual pragmatic practice of our economies, they're not. In fact, they're both a combination of somewhat of both. And Russia today is much more capitalist than it was at the time. But the Russians did try communal economics in some parts of the country, but there was a lot of corruption and leadership issues, and it was very much a hierarchy. It was run by an oligarchy, which is a small group of people, the Communist Party. And on the other side, America is not a capitalist nation anymore. We haven't been purely capitalist maybe before the Great Depression, but we don't. I think a lot of people aren't really fans of this idea that the government doesn't get involved or help in any shape or form, and the economy runs itself. And it was a lot of booms and busts. And Roosevelt kind of showed that when the government could step in and change things and stabilize the economy, people don't want booms and busts. And you could see that with the pandemic. The government spent $2 trillion, almost twice, and then another, like you're talking almost $5 trillion just on everything from vaccinations to giving people money. That is all government intervention. That is not capitalistic at all. That is socialistic. And then the second part is we would talk about infrastructure and spending trillions of dollars on infrastructure and rebuilding the city. Again, that in the country, that again is socialistic, and people aren't fighting it. So there's probably a balance between communism or socialism specifically and capitalism. So they're the socialists. It has to do with the economic situation and how they rule. In communism, it's actually a moneyless, classless society. And the Russians did not have a classless society, and they still had money. So they were not truly communist on any shape or form. But this battle is going to really start more with this idea of maybe democracy versus dictatorship. So while Hitler has been destroyed and committed suicide, Stalin has not. And Stalin was a good dictator to work with from the Americans at the time. But Stalin is quickly a bad dictator as soon as World War II is over. He's a pretty nasty guy. In a lot of ways, he makes Hitler look better in some forms. Stalin kills an estimated possibly 35 million people. He's absolutely ruthless to his own people, and that's Joseph Stalin, right there. And the Cold War is a competition between the U.S. and the USSR to overpower the others by building the most nuclear bombs and creating this best technology and spreading their ideas and furthering it in the world. Uh, and there's been some really positive consequences of the Cold War. So it wasn't all bad. It wasn't all building nuclear bombs and soon seeing who can outbuild the other group. But that was a lot of it. It went from 1947 all the way to 1991. 91 is kind of seeing the fall of the USSR and the end of this two power system. So what happens is you're going to either have to go with the USSR and they're the wealthy, powerful country, or America. Remember, we're the only ones really left standing. Europe is an absolute disaster. They just had a war. The Nazis have ripped apart, and the Italians have ripped apart Europe. They've destroyed countries, controlled them for years. They're just trying to get back on the ground. They've been bombed. The Americans and the Russians fought through all these countries and then tore up Germany in the end. I think the Russians are absolutely ruthless towards the Nazis. When they invaded, I think they raped something like over 3.5 million women in Germany. They usually had children born from this that are Russian and German heritage, and they had a name at one point after the war, and it was just nastiness. But they're all destroyed. Germany's destroyed. Everybody's done. Britain is still a hot mess because while they were probably one of the best shape, they'd still been bombed day and night by the Nazis for years, and their country had been torn apart. So America is untouched, and now we've got all this military might. We could change gears, right? We could change our factories, our American factories, into military factories, into civilian factories. Start making stuff people want, like refrigerators, cars. And we can do that now. We don't have to spend all our money and time making weapons and jeeps and tanks. And the USSR starting to think that way too. And Stalin is convinced he is going to isolate the USSR from the entire world, and he is going to force economic growth in this isolated dictatorship. And he is one of the historical examples of actually getting something done. He did, whether it's good or bad, he had about 8% growth, and he was completely isolated from the rest of the world, which is pretty amazing. How he did it was absolutely horrible and unethical. But basically what he did is he produced everything from cars. The Russians started building cars and refrigerators and manufacturing their own economy. He did horrible things like forced farming systems, and the Chinese would pick up on this as well. We'll find out. And he's a very nasty guy. And this is not sustainable. You cannot isolate yourself from the rest of the world. But Russia did have a lot of materials and a lot of oil, gas, natural resources that they could sustain this forced growth. And also you have to remember he's killing his own people at the same time. So when people are dying, others are keeping their jobs. Now, what happens in the end is obviously we know that they fall. Now, how nasty was Stalin? Well, I'm going to show you. Stalin is so paranoid. He is a master of propaganda, very much like Hitler and the Nazis. Then the Russians are, the USSR Soviet Union is so good at propaganda. I'm going to show you this. They would literally take a picture. See this guy on the right? He's a high Nikola Yusuf. And this is a picture of him with Stalin and other leadership. They killed the guy. They didn't like him. Stalin's scared of him. Stalin's paranoid. He thinks everybody's against him. And at some point, they start turning against him. Not only would he kill you under Stalin, he would erase you from history. So he would have his propaganda people take pictures and erase people and put the picture back. So kids at the time in history books are learning about propaganda, and he is changing that propaganda so that he can in fact change history, and the Russians can control the amount of information that is coming through the children